The roar was deafening, a symphony of destruction orchestrated across the shattered skies of Normandy. Tracers arced like angry red serpents, tearing through the greying canvas above the embattled earth. Metal shrieked against metal, an instant before the world exploded into fire and shrapnel. Fighter planes, once sleek predators, now tumbled like broken toys, their engines coughing their last, sending plumes of oily black smoke against the pale summer clouds. It was a maelstrom, a brutal dance of death where courage and fear intertwined in every split-second decision. In this inferno, unlikely heroes were forged, and even more unlikely acts of humanity would soon emerge. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of aerial combat in World War II, a brutal theater where men fought and died, often without ever seeing the face of their adversary. Yet, among the chaos, a German pilot, a young man sworn to uphold the fatherland, was about to face a truth far more profound than any propaganda, an irony so stark it would rewrite his understanding of the enemy and ultimately, himself. Erich Vogl, a lieutenant in the formidable Luftwaffe, gripped the stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He was barely 22, yet his eyes held the hardened gaze of a veteran, reflecting countless hours spent soaring above landscapes scarred by war. For Erich, flying wasn't just a duty, it was his identity, his purpose. He was a son of Germany, a skilled pilot entrusted with the defense of his homeland, and he carried that responsibility with an almost religious fervor. Today, his mission was reconnaissance over the contested Norman coast, a familiar stretch of territory that had become a brutal meat grinder for both sides. The air was thick with the scent of aviation fuel and spent gunpowder, a constant reminder of the high stakes involved in every patrol. Every twitch of his rudder, every adjustment of his throttle, was calculated, precise, a testament to years of rigorous training designed to turn young men into unflinching instruments of war. He believed in his cause, in the righteousness of his fight, and in the unwavering strength of the German war machine. Then, without warning, the world tilted violently. There was no scream of incoming rounds, no visual cue, just an instantaneous, gut-wrenching impact that tore through the fuselage. A sudden, savage jolt slammed him against his harness, and the controls went dead in his hands. A sharp, metallic smell filled the cockpit, acrid and suffocating. His carefully constructed reality fractured. The instrument panel flickered wildly, then died, plunging him into a terrifying silence broken only by the whistling of air through newly formed holes in the canopy. The Messerschmitt, once an extension of his will, became a dead weight, spiraling downwards, a wounded bird plummeting towards the verdant fields below. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat, but Vogel's training kicked in, a desperate, ingrained instinct for survival. He fought the lifeless stick, wrestling with the unresponsive aircraft, his mind racing through emergency procedures, even as he knew it was futile. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the unbearable G-forces pressing him into his seat. Expectation of capture or death, a fate he had long prepared for, loomed large. This was the end, he thought, the inevitable conclusion to his service. This incident, however, was not the end, but merely the beginning of an extraordinary tale. A story of improbable survival, unexpected compassion, and a profound re-evaluation of what it truly means to be human in the face of widespread conflict. If you find stories of courage, humanity, and the untold moments that shaped history as compelling as we do, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us bring more of these incredible narratives to light, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the light of human kindness can shine through. The Messerschmitt hit the earth with a jarring crunch, not a fiery explosion but a splintering, sickening thud that sent a shockwave of pain through Erich's already battered body. The impact was violent, twisting the metal around him into a grotesque cage, and for a terrifying moment, the world dissolved into a dizzying kaleidoscope of pain and dust. He lay there, dazed, the acrid smell of burnt oil and crushed foliage filling his nostrils, the taste of blood thick in his mouth. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he fought to keep his consciousness from slipping away. Every muscle screamed in protest, a cacophony of agony that threatened to overwhelm him. He pushed against the twisted wreckage, a primal instinct to escape, to breathe, overriding the searing pain in his leg. His head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the frantic pounding of his heart. When his vision finally cleared, he found himself amidst the mangled remains of what was once his proud aircraft, a stark testament to his sudden, unwelcome descent to Earth. The silence that followed the crash was almost more unsettling than the preceding chaos, a heavy, oppressive blanket broken only by his ragged, desperate gasps for air. He was alive, miraculously, but irrevocably broken. His uniform, once a symbol of his identity and strength, now felt like a heavy burden, drenched in sweat and grime, and stained with his own blood. The iron cross pinned to his chest, usually a source of pride, seemed to mock him in his current state of utter vulnerability. He was a Luftwaffe lieutenant, down deep behind what he knew to be enemy lines. His distinct uniform, with the eagle and swastika, left no doubt as to his allegiance. He was the enemy, undeniably so. A cold dread, far more chilling than the physical pain, began to creep into his consciousness. He tried to move, to crawl away from the wreckage, but a sharp, excruciating pain shot through his left leg, forcing a choked cry from his lips. He was trapped, helpless, and utterly exposed. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him, a German pilot, injured and vulnerable, in territory controlled by those he had sworn to fight. Suddenly, distant voices reached his ears, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. The sound was unmistakably English, harsh and guttural to his German-trained ears. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. He strained to see through the haze of pain and fear, his eyes darting frantically. Figures began to emerge from the tree line, moving cautiously, weapons at the ready. American soldiers. The sight sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He knew the stories, the propaganda about the brutal nature of the enemy, the expected harsh treatment for a downed German pilot. His mind raced, calculating his options, but his body betrayed him. He could not move, could not flee, could not even put up a token resistance. He was a defeated man before they even reached him, stripped bare of his fighter pilot's bravado, left with nothing but raw, animal fear. As the soldiers drew closer, their faces grim and wary, Erich braced himself for the inevitable. He expected shouts, rough handling, perhaps even summary judgment, given the fierce, no-quarter fighting that had defined the battle for Normandy. He closed his eyes for a brief second, steeling himself. When he opened them again, 4 soldiers stood over him, their rifles still pointed, but their expressions were not of unbridled aggression. One of them, a stocky sergeant with a grizzled face, knelt cautiously beside the wreckage. His eyes, though hardened by war, held a flicker of something unexpected, assessment, not immediate rage. He spoke, a string of rapid English that Erich couldn't fully comprehend, but the tone was surprisingly neutral, almost professional. Then, the sergeant gestured to another soldier, who carefully lowered his rifle. Instead of fists or harsh words, a pair of hands, surprisingly gentle, reached out towards Erich's injured leg, their touch tentative, exploratory. They were assessing his injuries. It was not the brutal encounter he had anticipated. The touch on his leg, though initially painful, was surprisingly delicate, a stark contrast to the brutal impact that had brought him down. It wasn't the rough, accusatory grab he had braced himself for, but a careful examination. The initial fear began to recede, replaced by a profound confusion. A young American soldier, his face smudged with dirt and fatigue, knelt beside him, his expression one of focused concern rather than animosity. He spoke again, his voice calm, but Erich still only caught fragments: injury, doc, bleeding. This wasn't the enemy he had been trained to hate, not the ruthless killer depicted in the propaganda posters. These men, despite their uniforms and weapons, were treating him not as a downed enemy combatant, but as an injured human being. It was a turning point, a fissure opening in the rigid walls of his wartime conditioning. The unexpected humanity, offered without question or judgment, began to chip away at everything he thought he knew about the other side. They weren't kicking him, or spitting at him, or interrogating him, they were assessing if he was hurt. Carefully, almost tenderly, they worked to stabilize his leg. One soldier produced a field dressing, applying pressure to a deep gash above his knee. Another meticulously fashioned a makeshift splint from a discarded piece of metal and strips of cloth torn from his own uniform. Their movements were swift, practiced, and professional, executed with a quiet efficiency that spoke of experience and a genuine desire to alleviate suffering. Erich watched them, his mind a whirl of disbelief. He was a Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over enemy territory, yet these men, his supposed adversaries, were prioritizing his survival. The sheer incongruity of the situation was disorienting. He had been so utterly convinced that his fate would be a harsh one, that any mercy would be a privilege, not a given. This act of unexpected kindness, born from the very men he was sworn to destroy, was a jolt to his system, shaking the very foundations of his ingrained beliefs. He was no longer just a downed pilot, but a patient in need, and they, surprisingly, were his caregivers. Soon, a jeep arrived, bumping precariously over the rough terrain. Erich was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through his leg, but even then, the soldiers were gentle, murmuring reassurances he couldn't fully understand but somehow still appreciated. The journey to the American field hospital was a blur of jostling and pain, a landscape of fear and confusion. He lay on his back, staring up at the shifting canopy of trees and fleeting glimpses of a smoke-hazed sky, the physical discomfort a constant, throbbing counterpoint to the mental shock he was experiencing. Every bump, every jarring turn, was a fresh reminder of his broken body, yet the overwhelming sensation was one of pure bewilderment. He was being transported by the enemy, to the enemy's medical facility, for treatment. It simply defied all logic, all the training, all the rhetoric. Upon arrival, the field hospital was a bustling hub of activity, a canvas tent overflowing with the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and the low moans of men in pain. Doctors and nurses moved with an urgent, practiced grace, their faces etched with exhaustion yet focused on their tasks. Erich was quickly transferred to a cot, and almost immediately, an American doctor, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, bent over him. His eyes, though tired, held a direct, assessing gaze. He spoke to Erich, asking questions in English, and when Erich could only offer a weak, pained shake of his head, the doctor simply nodded, understanding the language barrier, and proceeded with his examination. There was no recrimination in his touch, no hint of the animosity Erich had so firmly expected. He was just another casualty, another body requiring urgent attention, regardless of the uniform he wore. As the doctor worked, cleaning and bandaging his wounds with meticulous care, Erich watched the surrounding scene. He saw American soldiers, blooded and torn, being treated alongside what appeared to be other German prisoners, their uniforms unmistakably familiar. The sight caused a knot to form in his stomach. Here, in the heart of the enemy's medical sanctuary, the lines between friend and foe seemed to blur. He battled with his conditioning, with the years of propaganda that had painted the Americans as brutal, unfeeling monsters. His pride as a German soldier, his ingrained belief in the superiority of his nation, warred with the undeniable reality unfolding before his eyes. Each gentle touch, each word of quiet reassurance, each professional action chipped away at the edifice of hate and prejudice he had unknowingly built. The concept of venomy, so clearly defined just hours before, was now undergoing a profound and unsettling redefinition, challenged by these simple, undeniable acts of kindness. He felt a strange, alien warmth spreading through him, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but one that was undeniably human. He felt a strange, alien warmth spreading through him, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but one that was undeniably human. The field hospital, a cacophony of quiet suffering and urgent activity, became Erich's temporary world. It was a sprawling canvas tent, hot and humid, filled with the pungent scents of iodine, sweat, and stale blood. Stretchers lined the walls, each holding a wounded man, some stirring fitfully, others lying in a state of suspended animation, their faces pale and drawn. Nurses, their white aprons often splattered with crimson, moved with a relentless efficiency, administering injections, changing dressings, and offering sips of water. Doctors, their foreheads beaded with perspiration, performed minor surgeries under the harsh glare of portable lamps, their hands precise and tireless. It was a place of grim realities, yet, amidst the suffering, there was an undercurrent of unwavering dedication, a shared purpose that transcended national allegiances. What struck Erich most profoundly was the lack of distinction. He watched, mesmerized and bewildered, as an American private, grievously wounded in the leg, received the same meticulous care as a German sergeant whose arm was shattered by shrapnel. There were no harsh words exchanged, no scowls of contempt, no obvious prejudice. Just the quiet, professional execution of medical duty. A young American corporal, barely older than Erich himself, whimpered softly from his cot, his eyes wide with pain, and a nurse immediately knelt to adjust his foot drip, her voice soft and soothing. Hours later, an older German soldier, his face etched with the grim lines of battle, called out in delirium, and that same nurse was there, placing a cool cloth on his forehead, speaking to him in gentle, if accented, German phrases. She must have learned. This was not the war he knew, not the enemy he had been taught to despise. This was simply humanity in action, stripped of its uniforms and anthems. Several American doctors and nurses interacted directly with Erich during his stay. Dr. Jensen, a burly man with kind eyes hidden behind spectacles, frequently checked on his leg, explaining the healing process in basic German, clearly making an effort. He spoke of the shrapnel wound, the clean break of his tibia, and the slow, arduous path to recovery. Nurse Miller, a young woman with a surprisingly serene demeanor amidst the chaos, brought him water and bland food, her touch always gentle, her questions always about his comfort. They didn't interrogate him, didn't chastise him, didn't even hint at the vast chasm that separated their countries. They simply saw him as a patient, a body in need of healing. Their professionalism was absolute, their empathy palpable. He found himself answering their questions about his pain, about his thirst, without hesitation, his guardedness slowly dissolving under the weight of their unassuming kindness. He began to see them not as faceless components of an opposing war machine, but as individuals, people with families, with lives, with a simple yet profound capacity for compassion. The emotional breakthrough came subtly, not with a sudden shock, but with a gradual, overwhelming tide. It was late evening, the sounds of distant shelling a dull rumble, a constant reminder of the world outside the tent's fragile peace. Erich lay awake, his leg throbbing, but his mind focused on the scene before him. Dr. Jensen, after a long shift, sat slumped on a stool, head in his hands, clearly exhausted. Nurse Miller, with a weary but tender smile, brought him a cup of coffee. Their brief, quiet exchange, a moment of shared human vulnerability, struck Erich with the force of a physical blow. He thought of his own family, his parents, his younger sister, huddled in their cellar back home, praying for his safety. He thought of the young faces he had seen in the cockpits of Allied planes, the ones he had shot down, the ones he had tried to kill. Suddenly, a dam broke within him. It wasn't the physical pain that caused it, though his body ached. It was the crushing weight of the realization, the profound, undeniable truth of the moment. These people, his enemies, had saved his life. They were treating him with a dignity and care he would have never afforded them, had their roles been reversed. The years of propaganda, the indoctrination, the fierce loyalty to his cause, all crumbled under the sheer, unadulterated force of their humanity. A hot, unfamiliar sensation welled up in his chest, rising up his throat, until he could no longer hold it back. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down his face, soaking the pillow. He wept, not from fear, not from pain, but from a profound mix of shock, guilt, gratitude, and an overwhelming, shattering sense of human connection that transcended all boundaries. It was a release, a complete and utter surrender to the profound goodness he had encountered, a goodness he had never expected, least of all from the enemy. The profound goodness he had encountered, a goodness he had never expected, least of all from the enemy, forced a seismic shift within Erich Vogl's very being. Lying on that cot, the tears still damp on his cheeks, he began to reflect, truly reflect, on the nature of the war he was fighting. All his life, or at least since the rise of the Third Reich, he had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, stories of the enemy's barbarity, their inherent evil, their desire to crush the German spirit. He had believed it, wholeheartedly. It had fueled his courage in the cockpit, solidified his resolve to fight and, if necessary, to die for his fatherland. But now, bruised and broken, receiving compassionate care from those same monsters, the carefully constructed edifice of his beliefs began to crumble, brick by painful brick. He remembered the impassioned speeches, the rallies, the unwavering conviction that Germany was fighting a just and necessary war against forces that sought its annihilation. Yet, here he was, saved by those very forces. This wasn't just a re-evaluation of his captors, it was a re-evaluation of everything. The lines between right and wrong, hero and villain, became impossibly blurred. He thought of the faces of his comrades, their shared purpose, their unwavering loyalty. He thought of the young Allied pilots he had engaged in dogfights, the planes he had seen plummeting to earth, knowing that living, breathing men, just like him, were inside. Had they families? Wives? Children? Had they, too, been told tales of German inhumanity? The sheer idiocy of it all, the tragic cycle of hatred perpetuated by lies, washed over him with a crushing weight. He had been a cog in that machine, a willing participant in the dehumanization of an entire people. His personal experience now stood in stark, undeniable contrast to every piece of indoctrination, every rousing speech, every carefully crafted newsreel. He saw the humanity in the faces around him, the shared weariness, the quiet determination to alleviate suffering, and it made the carefully cultivated hatred seem utterly senseless, a monstrous fabrication. A deeper, more complex emotional development began to unfold within him. Not only was there profound gratitude for his rescuers, a gratitude that felt almost sacrilegious given his allegiance, but also a burgeoning sense of remorse. Not remorse for being a soldier, for doing his duty as he understood it, but remorse for the active dehumanization of the enemy. He had been trained to see them as targets, as extensions of an abstract evil, not as individuals capable of kindness, of mercy, of shared vulnerability. The tears he had shed were not merely for his own survival, but for the realization of the vast, wasted potential for shared understanding that had been squandered in the name of conflict. How many such acts of kindness had been missed, overshadowed by the roar of cannons and the thunder of bombs? He felt a deep, almost physical pang of regret for every moment he had allowed himself to be swept up in the tide of animosity, for every time he had seen a uniform rather than a human face. This remorse was inextricably intertwined with a profound gratitude, a feeling that clawed at his conscience. His life, his very existence, had been preserved by the hands of those he had once sought to destroy. It created an agonizing internal conflict. How could he reconcile the dutiful, patriotic Lieutenant Vogl, sworn to fight and kill for his nation, with the grateful, humbled man now indebted to the American soldiers and medics? The propaganda had taught him that weakness was death, that mercy was a luxury afforded only to the victor, and certainly not to the enemy. Yet, here he was, a living testament to the fact that mercy, genuine, uncalculated mercy, existed even in the brutal heart of war. It felt like a betrayal of his comrades, of his cause, to feel such overwhelming thankfulness towards the other side. This emotional burden, the weight of being saved by those he was trained to kill, forged a new internal battle, one far more complex and personal than any aerial dogfight. He wrestled with the paradox, trying to fit this experience into his existing worldview, but it simply wouldn't conform. His mind, once so clear in its purpose, was now a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and challenging thoughts. He saw the American soldiers continuing their duty, their faces grim but resolute, and knew they would return to the fight. He knew they would continue to shoot down German planes, and German soldiers would continue to try and kill them. But for him, something fundamental had changed. The simple narrative of good versus evil had shattered. He began to question the very fabric of his reality, the motivations that drove men to such extreme violence, and the possibility, however faint, that there was another way. This was not merely a physical recovery, it was a profound spiritual and psychological awakening, a forced confrontation with the universality of humanity. He had survived the crash, the capture, the physical wounds. Now, he faced the far more daunting task of reconciling his past service with his present, overwhelming gratitude, and the undeniable truth that the enemy had a heart, just like his own. The silent, almost imperceptible shift within him was a testament to the power of human connection, even amid the greatest horrors of war. The silent, almost imperceptible shift within him was a testament to the power of human connection, even amid the greatest horrors of war. As the days turned into weeks, Lieutenant Erich Vogel's physical recovery progressed steadily. The field hospital, though still a place of constant activity and grim reminders of the ongoing conflict, became a sanctuary of unexpected introspection. His leg, though still painful, began to mend, the sharp agony gradually subsiding into a dull ache. He was no longer confined to the cot, eventually able to hobble a few steps with the aid of crutches, a small victory in his journey back to some semblance of normalcy. But it was not just his body that was healing. His emotional and psychological transformation, sparked by that flood of unexpected tears, was even more profound and, in many ways, more challenging. Each interaction, each kind word from a nurse, each professional touch from a doctor, reinforced the unsettling truth that contradicted everything he had ever been taught about the enemy. He started to accept the kindness shown to him, not as a trick or an anomaly, but as a genuine expression of shared human compassion. The initial shock gave way to a deeper contemplation, a quiet processing of the monumental implications of his experience. He saw the genuine concern in their eyes, heard the sincerity in their voices, and it began to reprogram the very core of his understanding. This period of recovery became what Erich would later describe as his true greatest battle. It wasn't the aerial dogfights, the G-forces, or the relentless pursuit of an enemy fighter that tested his mettle most profoundly. It was the internal struggle to accept that the enemy can have a heart. This was a fight against ingrained prejudice, against years of calculated hatred, against the very foundation of his identity as a soldier dedicated to annihilating the opposition. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, had been trained to dehumanize the foe, to see them as soulless instruments of an evil ideology. Yet, here he was, being nursed back to health by those very individuals. The kindness was a weapon against his prejudice, subtly dismantling the walls of animosity he had erected. He grappled with the cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable truth that the individuals who tended to his wounds, who spoke to him with respect despite his uniform, were the same ones he had been trained to kill. He had to reconcile the image of the ruthless, faceless enemy with the thoughtful, compassionate faces of Dr. Jensen and Nurse Miller, with the careful hands of the American medics. This mental and emotional wrestling match was far more exhausting than any physical exertion, demanding a complete overhaul of his worldview. He spent countless hours during his convalescence observing, listening, and thinking. He saw American soldiers sharing cigarettes with German prisoners, heard laughter between them, witnessed moments of shared stories, albeit through interpreters. These were not the monsters of propaganda, they were men, caught in the same devastating war, experiencing similar fears and hopes, capable of both brutal violence and profound tenderness. This realization, so simple yet so revolutionary, began to sow seeds of hope within him. Hope that perhaps, one day, such divisions could be overcome, or at least questioned, on a broader scale. His personal experience, vivid and undeniable, hinted at a future where understanding might transcend uniforms and flags. It was a faint, almost forbidden thought in the midst of total war, but it persisted. If he, a dedicated Luftwaffe pilot, could find humanity in his sworn enemy, then perhaps others could too. Erich started to contemplate a future for himself, one where this newfound understanding would guide his actions. He knew the war was far from over, and his immediate future was uncertain, likely involving a prisoner of war camp. But beyond that, beyond the conflict, he felt a burgeoning responsibility. He had witnessed something extraordinary, a testament to shared humanity that begged to be acknowledged. His life had been saved not by chance, but by conscious, compassionate choices made by individuals who easily could have seen him only as a target. This profound act of mercy had transformed him, reshaping his perspective on life, war, and the intricate web of human relationships. He began to envision a post-war world, not as a victor or a vanquished, but as someone uniquely positioned to speak of the unifying power of empathy. His experience had given him a purpose far beyond the military objectives he had once held sacred. It was a profound, personal mission, to carry the lesson of kindness and shared humanity, a lesson learned in the most unlikely of places, from the most unexpected of teachers. The implications of this realization were immense, pointing towards a path of reconciliation and understanding that would define the rest of his life. He felt a quiet resolve growing within him, a determination to honor the extraordinary compassion he had received. He felt a quiet resolve growing within him, a determination to honor the extraordinary compassion he had received. The immediate future, as Erich had anticipated, involved his transfer from the American field hospital to a prisoner of war camp. The day of his departure was marked by a quiet farewell. Dr. Jensen offered a firm handshake, his eyes conveying a silent understanding that transcended words. Nurse Miller, her usual serene expression tinged with a hint of sadness, presented him with a small, carefully folded piece of paper, a note written in rudimentary German wishing him recovery and peace. Erich, still on crutches, felt a lump in his throat. He mumbled his thanks, his voice thick with emotion, acutely aware of the profound impact these individuals had made on his life. He was still a prisoner, his freedom gone, his nation at war, but he was no longer the same man who had crashed in that field. The conflict of survival had been resolved, but the emotional impact of his rescue, the indelible mark of unexpected human kindness, would remain with him long after the war's end. He carried with him not just the scars of battle, but a far more precious lesson, learned from the very people he had been taught to despise. The POW camp was a harsh reality, a stark contrast to the relative comfort and compassionate care of the field hospital. Life there was about survival, about enduring the tedium and the deprivations. Yet, even within the confines of the camp, Erich's newfound perspective offered him a different outlook. He saw fellow prisoners, German soldiers, still clinging to the old narratives of hate and vengeance, their eyes burning with unspent animosity. He heard their bitter complaints, their vows of retribution, and he understood them, for he had once shared those very sentiments. But something fundamental had shifted within him. He found himself unable to participate in the collective resentment, unable to stoke the flames of hatred. Instead, he carried the memory of Dr. Jensen's kind eyes and Nurse Miller's gentle hands, a silent counter-narrative to the prevailing bitterness. He became a quiet observer, listening more than he spoke, his experiences forming a personal shield against the dehumanizing rhetoric that still permeated the camp. His gratitude for his rescue was not a secret he broadcasted, but a deeply personal truth that shaped his reactions and his very being. As the war finally drew to a close, and the Allied victory became undeniable, Erich, like countless others, navigated the difficult path of repatriation. The silence of the post-war era was deafening, not just the absence of bombs and gunfire, but the quiet introspection that followed the monumental devastation. For many, it was a time of immense guilt, of grappling with the consequences of a lost war and the horrors committed in its name. But for Erich, his silence was not marked by the guilt of defeat in the same way. Rather, it was underscored by a profound, almost spiritual gratitude for his rescue. That act of saving his life, performed by his supposed enemies, had ultimately set him free, not just from the confines of his downed aircraft, but from the far more insidious prison of hate and prejudice. It had liberated his mind, allowing him to see beyond the propaganda, beyond the uniforms, to the shared humanity that connected all people. In the decades that followed, Erich Vogl lived a quiet life, rebuilding what had been lost, but always carrying that transformative experience within him. He rarely spoke of the war, not out of shame, but because the most significant part of his wartime experience was ineffable, a profound personal awakening that transcended easy explanation. He never forgot the faces of those who had shown him mercy, never lost the lesson they had imparted. His life became a testament to the power of human connection beyond conflict, a living embodiment of the truth that even in the darkest hours, compassion can flourish, bridging divides thought to be insurmountable. He learned that true strength wasn't in fighting, but in understanding, in empathy, and in the courage to challenge one's own ingrained prejudices. And so, the story of Luftwaffe Lieutenant Erich Vogl, downed over Normandy, rescued by American soldiers, stands as a powerful reminder that humanity, in its most profound and unexpected forms, can emerge even from the crucible of combat, offering a glimmer of hope for reconciliation in a world often fractured by division. His story, along with countless others from the hidden corners of history, reminds us of the incredible human capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and connection. These are the narratives that challenge our assumptions, deepen our understanding, and ultimately, unite us. If Erich Vogel's journey from enemy combatant to a beacon of unexpected humanity resonated with you, if it sparked a flicker of hope or a moment of reflection, then please consider liking this video, sharing it with those who might benefit from its message, and most importantly, subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these untold stories, bringing to light the moments when courage and compassion defied the chaos of conflict. Join us next time as we delve into another extraordinary human story, reminding us that even amidst the grand sweep of history, the intricate tapestry of individual lives holds the most poignant and powerful lessons.